on that, so we'll spend a little more time tonight talking about that. But some of the themes, once again, that are introduced in the Jacob story or built on the Jacob story, they've already been introduced, but that will play out in the Joseph narrative. And one of the things that I thought about was when you're looking at stories, and I had this real sense in looking at Jacob. I don't know about you, but growing up, Jacob was taught as kind of one of the heroes. And the more I spent time looking at Jacob, especially the more I looked at the detail of it, one thing you're struck with is the Bible, it very often is very realistic. It's not going to gloss over things. So like when I do a memorial service, I interview people, I get facts and some stories and all that. And so then I craft that into story. And so really my approach in doing a memorial service is to try to tell the story in a way that doesn't feature the bad things about the person or the disappointments of the person or all that, but try to highlight the good things, the things we're grateful for, all that. Well, the narrator of Genesis is more honest than I am on those memorial services. I even had one guy talking about Joe Johnson, who used to be president of the University of Tennessee. I did a funeral for somebody that he knew well, very well, and he and his wife both said, you jumped over some mud puddles tonight. There were some things you just didn't step into because he knew the person's warts and all. But when you're dealing with Jacob, yikes, you see things, you're just scratching your head. But one of the good things about that, I think, Greg, is as we look at the story tonight, we'll see that grace is not simply a New Testament experience. That God uses mixed up, crazy, confused, selfish people. He calls them to be a part of what he's doing in the world. Any thoughts on that so far?
No, obviously you've provided some good references for me this week. But I mean, this concept of the transformation, it's really hard to. Probably wondering why it took us long to get to Joseph, but it's just as you read the story, you have to peel it back, and you find so much of this God's providence and His grace that's evidence. And yeah, it's we'll get into kind of the names and all those layers of deceit, but I think it certainly could hit home to a lot of people in their life experiences. So.
Yeah. So this is a story of transformation. I'm borrowing that imagery from a scholar named Hamilton. I forget, maybe Victor Hamilton, but he's got a commentary on Genesis, but he's also written some other things. But I feel like he's done a really good job in looking at this story, talking about where Jacob is when the story begins with him and where he ends up at the end of and then back into the land. So the personal journey is being told in the context of this journey that goes out and back in. So if you got your Bible with you, let's open up to Genesis chapter 25. And 25 begins with Abraham taking another wife, and that might be interesting for you to look at. We don't have time, but Keturah, and very often be hostile towards each other, and especially towards the line of the promise that's working its way from Abraham to Isaac and now to Jacob, and then on to Judah after that. But so we get in verse 19. Let's just read just very briefly here. It says, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. So Laban's going to be mentioned again in this story, and that story about Isaac and how it comes about to have Rebekah as wife is a beautifully told story just a couple of chapters earlier, and it's a wonderfully told story. But what you find is that Isaac, you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are viewed as the patriarchs, right? And Isaac is kind of the silent one. There's not a whole lot that happens through him. He's more of a passive character in the story. And so you have Abraham and all that goes on, and then you have Jacob being the next real kind of focus. But one of the things that you're going to see is, just like with Sarah, Rebekah's going to have trouble conceiving, just like Rachel will have trouble conceiving. And so that's a pattern in the story that God is going to be working, but God's working His promise. It's not always easy. So it says, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah's wife conceived, and the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. And when her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all of his body like a hairy cloak, and so they called his name Esau. And afterwards his brother came out with his hand holding to Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. And when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Jacob because he ate of his game, but Isaac loved Esau because of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So, Gregory, as I read that kind of introductory story, what thoughts do you have with all that as far as what's kind of being introduced to us?
Yeah, I mean, again, the idea of barrenness is important, I think, in some of the struggles that we see in these characters. I think struggle, and we'll get into later stories about, God, Jacob wrestling with God. And so I think these are things that are important to build up to that. Obviously, there's a 20-year span there, and so we don't really know a lot. I think the narrator, I think either intentionally or whatever, leaves out some things we wish we knew. But so we don't know if for 20 years, between the time they got married to the time they had, Rebecca became pregnant with the twins, what's going on there. But I think it's intentional that we'll see it throughout. That when they reach out to God, He answers and He's faithful. The other thing, just kind of picking up some text, and we'll get into more about Esau, is just this concept of preference and favoritism is already coming out, and it's another theme that we've all seen throughout. So,
yeah. And so you have Jacob's name, which means grasps. So he's grasping that heel, but it also means deceiver or cheat. So it has those. So apparently the idea of the deceiver or cheat comes from that idea of grabbing onto somebody, holding on. So there's a play in the language there. But it's interesting, you'll see that theme, that deceitfulness being worked out in this story. And even that grappling with, or that struggling with, or holding on to, will be a part of the story that will come later. We won't look at this tonight, but that new name change where he wrestles with God. But there's still that image of he's grappling, he's holding on to, he doesn't want to let go of. So there's something in him that is clutching there. So, but you also have this statement, this oracle that God gives to Rachel. So before Jacob and Esau are born, God has a plan. We've already seen that. He's made promises to Abraham. And so there is in Scripture this idea of God being really the main character. He's the one who's acting, and He's acting with His purpose. And one of the things that's not really strong in our tradition is this idea of election, that God chooses people, and that it doesn't annihilate human freedom and human decision and all that, but it means that God is not just up there waiting and going, well, let's see what happens. So do you have any thoughts about how election works, or this idea of God announcing His plan beforehand and those kind of things? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think I'm not qualified, I think, to talk about kind of concepts of predestination. Those are things that you can speak of when, from the pulpit. But I think there's clearly references in the commentaries we picked up on about, into Romans. You'll talk about that. But I think it's very telling here. And if I go ahead and just mention, there's a passage in Romans that you all have probably read or heard, and it's in Romans 9:13. It says, Jacob, have I loved, Esau have I hated. And there's some other passages even in the New Testament about that. And I think there's That's been a struggle for a lot of people. But I think it's really important that, number one, when you're reading Scripture, and I think this is part of our heritage here, is not to water anything down. I think we've got to take it for what it is, which is there's a reason why the passage says, Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated. And I think sometimes people will say, well, he just loved him less or things like that. No, I think you have to, let God speak and say, no, there's a reason why. There's this dichotomy there of the two. And I think it's intentional. I think God's sovereignty is intentional. I wanted to read, I found a passage about, or a quote from Charles Spurgeon about this I think I wanted to share. And it says, I can tell you the reason why God loved Jacob and maybe hated Esau it's sovereign grace. There was nothing in Jacob that could make God love him. There was everything about him that might have made God hate him as much as he did Esau, just the deception and his name and all the things that we'll read about him. But it was because God was infinitely gracious that he loved Jacob, and because he was sovereign in his dispensation of his grace, that he chose Jacob as the object of his love. So again, we all know it. We don't know sometimes why God does what he does, but he's divine. But that's important, as we'll see in that theme throughout.
One qualifier on that I probably would mention is, so there are times where love, hate are used in that sense of the way we normally use those words. But also, you think about where Jesus is talking about, he talks about hating your father and mother and your brother and sister and loving him or loving God more. And so that may be a part of even that, you see a use of language there that doesn't necessarily mean you hate, wish dead, or whatever, because you do see God blessing Esau, and there are good things that are coming from him, but there is a choice of Jacob over Esau early, before he's born, where that the older will serve the younger, but where God is showing preference toward, but for his purpose. And just like with Abraham, where God's choosing him. But one of the things you find is that very often with election, it doesn't mean that everything goes great. Very often you see that whether it be Abraham being elected or Israel being elected, it also means greater responsibility, difficult things, persecution against, all those other kinds of understandings. And one of the other things is that when Paul uses the idea of election, for example, in Ephesians, he talks about how we are elect. We're electing Christ. We are now chosen and a part of this elective purpose of God, that he's got this thing that he is working with, and he works with all the complications of what we call life. So, for example, you go back a little bit earlier than Romans 9, you go in Romans 8, Paul is talking about what the future is going to be like, this new creation, the remaking of all things. But right in the middle of that is where he talks about God, who works all things together for good for those who love him. So he loves us, but we also are loving him. And part of our choice is we either choose to love God with all our heart, mind, and soul, or there is that hatred toward God, that going, I don't want God to be God. I don't want to be a part of God's kingdom where he's ruling. Instead, I want to be ruling. I want to do it on my own, which takes us all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, where God says, this is what I want you to do in perfect fellowship with Adam and Eve. But then the temptation, and we'll probably look at one of those videos coming up pretty soon, not tonight, but coming up, where we look at that intentional decision instead of following what God wants, going, well, I've got a better idea. And but even God uses the, quote, better ideas, which are not. Even in that story, the fall, he talks about one who will come, so the elect one, Jesus, who will come, who will crush the head of the serpent, even though the serpent will bruise the heel of his foot. So you have this profound idea that God is in control, he is acting, he's the major one, but we somehow are in ways that none of us really understand. If you think you can explain it, well, that shows we're all crazy a bit. But God is saying, you are invited to be with me and to do this together with me.
Yeah, and that's in the passage I just read about Romans, and it references Malachi, a passage in
Malachi,
Malachi
right?
1:2. That's
Yes.
where it's and so in
And
that
that's where the
in
quote
that
comes from.
context, it is talking about with him loving Jacob and hating Esau is this idea of a preference over his chosen people,
Right.
and he has designed and divined the Israelites to be the seed. And so we see that throughout. And of course, yeah, I think there's clearly some things in the life of Esau that that are not so great either.
Yeah.
Hebrews 12:16, talks about see that no one is godless like Esau. So
Yeah.
he's an important character to be used in the story.
Yes.
But he did, we'll get into the birthright piece, but it's, he's certainly without blame.
Yeah, and so that's what in Hebrews is being talked about, and that's our next paragraph. They're still there in chapter 25. Remember, and some of this we'll just kind of refer to in passing, but Esau's been out hunting all day. It's one of the things his dad loves about him. He's a hunter, and his dad likes that wild game and all that, and Jacob is kind of appears almost a mama's boy because he stays in the tent. He's not active and engaged like his brother is. So they're twins, but it's obvious they're not identical twins, right? Because one is really hairy and red, the other is smooth skin. Some talk about that's even that description talks about him as kind of a slippery, manipulative personality. So it's describing him physically, but it also has a metaphorical reference that he's a manipulator. He's deceitful. But Esau's been out hunting, and what is Jacob doing while Esau's out hunting? What's Jacob doing? He's cooking. He's cooked this stew, this red stew, and Esau has come in famished. My guess is sometimes during those trek days, you're really, really hungry. You ever notice that when you're doing that, food tastes better when it's done fairly well. It really, you kind of go, this is really good. But it kind of, you just really reach that point, got to have something. And Esau is going, I'm just so hungry, will you give me something to eat? And his brother's not a thoughtful, well, of course, you're my brother, I'll share with you. Instead, it's well, if you give me that birthright, and birthright and blessing are not exactly the same thing. So when we talk about the birthright, typically at this time and within this culture, the birthright went to the oldest son, and basically what you had was the estate, when somebody died, the estate would be divided into equal parts, and the oldest would get one of those equal shares plus another share. So it would be equal parts, but it would be the addition of one more because the older person would be pretty much left in charge of the family now. Now, if the head of the family was gone, that's the person who would move up into that slot and would have more. And so Esau basically is saying, okay, I'll give you my share. I'll give you that extra apportionment. I'll give that to you, but otherwise I'm just going to die. I just got to have food. Which once again is that like, you kind of think about, how does this guy's mind work? He's obviously not an accountant, right? He doesn't have that master's in business degree that you have. He's just kind of looking at things of right now, I got to have it.
Yeah, I think there's some indication there as well as about where his motives are and his passions are. I read some historical context this week that, this is a farming, this is a agrarian, but this is really a time when people are raising sheep and raising livestock, and hunting actually in this, was not really kind of the norm. And so
It's a way to go.
it's right. So it's really one of those things where you can maybe get some insight there that Esau's just doing what he wants to do, and he's not really following sort of the norms there as well. So he can already tell.
His dad loves it, though.
But his dad loves it, yeah. And so I think there's some hint there of him, and we'll see. Obviously, there's some other things that he does. We'll mention that I think displease the father.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. So when we get to chapter 26, which we won't talk about, but that's where Isaac and Rebekah kind of image what Abraham and Sarah did with Abimelech. So there's differences, similarities in those stories. But at the end of it, it says in verse 34, when Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basmath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. So Esau, once again, that kind of independence, asserting his independence, not consulting. And once again, we have this kind of mindset, well, that's what you do. You go out and you find your mate. But in this culture, very often these marriages were arranged. Father and mother very often had input about that. And Esau is kind of going his own way, right? Mm-hmm. So that leads us to 27, one of those other one of those really famous stories. So it says, when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, my son. And he answered, here I am. He said, behold, I'm old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, and that my soul may bless you before I die. Well, Rebekah overhears that. Now, remember, in the chapter before, Rebekah had asked God, what's this going on inside me? And there's an oracle. We're not quite sure where that came from. It's one of those questions. Mm-hmm. So how did that oracle come to her in a dream? Did a prophet arrive? What was? But anyway, the oracle said that her younger son would be the greater one. He'd receive the blessing. That's what's really being set up. And my guess is that over these years, as these boys are growing up, that Isaac was not naive about what God had said to Rebekah. And she's favoring that son that God says I favor, and Isaac is favoring Esau. And so now Rebekah overhears Isaac going, look, this is what I want you to do. Go out, get the food, and he's getting ready to bless his son because he's going, I can't see well, I'm older, all that. Now, culturally, so once again, I would not have known this necessarily, but culturally, when there was the blessing, it was right, very close to the time of death. So he's going, I don't know when I'm going to die. So that's what he said. But it wouldn't just be the older son who'd be called in. All the sons would be called in. And there wouldn't just be the blessing for the older son. There would be blessings for different ones. And that's where it'd be made clear to everybody involved what the transition was going to look like and be. You see an example of that in Genesis chapter 49, where Jacob is old, he's about to die, and he calls in all the sons, and they all hear these blessings. And you hear some really interesting things. You kind of go, you call that a blessing? Mm-hmm. When I read some of those, I'm kind of going, I scratch my head going, I don't quite, there's something I'm missing. But anyway, Rebekah realizes that Jacob is about to go around what God has said. So she, like Sarah and Abraham and others, decide that God, being sovereign and the main actor, and once again, they don't know things that we know. So it's, once again, we're kind of doing the hindsight thing. But Rebekah's going, I got to fix this. This is a problem because he's getting ready to bless Esau, and the blessing should go to Jacob. And so she decides that God needs help. She's going to have to manipulate all this. And so one of the things you see in this story is deception. We've seen deception before in the story of Abraham and of Isaac. But now what we see is more deception, and Rebekah is the sister of Laban, and what you're going to find a little bit later on is Laban is a deceiver. He is better at this deceiving game than Jacob is, right? So he's going to be a teacher to Jacob of what it means to be deceived. So Rebekah comes up with this plan that she tells Jacob to join her in that, and he kind of raises, well, wonder if Dad finds me out and I get cursed. Oh, don't worry about that. So that's where she comes up with kind of the goat gloves and on the arms and the hands and on the chest, apparently, and she's going to fix the food exactly the same way. And that's when, so what you realize is, I mean, have you ever thought when you read that story, you kind of go, so how is touching goatskin gloves, have that either Esau is really, really hairy, or you have a sense in which maybe Isaac is a bit senile and can't reason as carefully. But even when Jacob comes in, he knows the voice is not that of Esau. He's got questions. So I don't know that the senile thing works. But that kind of raised the question, does Isaac actually know that what he's trying to do is not what God wants done? And so that there's somehow where he's moving along with this. Because you see a little bit later when Rebekah comes to him and says, we need to let Jacob go to the land of my fathers to get a spouse. Isaac agrees to that and blesses Jacob once again. It's not reluctant or whatever. But what you have in this story is Jacob receives the blessing, and he leaves, and then Esau comes in with the game and all that, and Isaac seems very upset. He trembles. He seems very upset about this and going, I've already given the blessing, and I can't take it back. Now, in our culture, you go, well, I'm going to take that back. I was deceived, so I'm going to take that back. But we have a very different view of the power and the meaning of words and of promises, and these blessings are related to covenant promise. And so there are a lot of people who go, you politicians, I promise you I'm going to do this, and then they get elected and that's not there. Or car dealers are notorious for making promises they don't keep. And in the story, Isaac blesses Jacob, and he lets Esau know, I can't change it. Esau says, well, don't you have some blessing for me? And he gives him a blessing, but once again, it's not a great blessing. It kind of reverses some of the terms that are used in Isaac's blessing when you read that carefully. But what you have is this attempt to somehow manipulate or to change God, and that sometimes the human effort to kind of give God help creates more problems. And what's obvious now is that Esau, you read that a little bit later in this chapter, he hates his brother. And what he's going to do is he's going to wait until his father is dead, and he's going to take his brother's life. And that's what Rebekah hears, and that's where she says, we got to get Jacob out of town. So any thoughts on that story or that section?
Just a couple. I think that it's important to foreshadow, again, what you said at the end of Genesis, where even Jacob sort of changes the terms of a blessing, and a little unexpected twist we find at the end when he's trying to bless Joseph's children. So, but I think back to this is important. And again, tease for next week, is we won't have time. Is with the blessing. I mean, this blessing was received in deceit, and we'll find shortly where he also asks and wants a blessing from God, and when he wrestles with God.
With God, yes.
So there's a different piece here, and I think God has an intention there of, that's not going to be given on your terms, it's going to be given on my terms.
Right.
I think that's a good.
God even asks, so what is your name?
Yeah.
And
that's a
so
big one.
there's echoes of, are you really Esau? And
that's right.
so,
and that's a big.
But God
deal,
is not going
yeah.
to be deceived by Jacob when that time comes.
Right.
Not tonight, but it'll come.
Right.
I do want to point out, Gregory, so once again, we mentioned Esau's independence and that decision to go around his parents to find wives. So, and you see that being used by Rebekah there in 46 of chapter 27. Then Rebekah said to Isaac, I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me? So Rebekah has a way of getting her way. She knows how to kind of really put the pressure on. And Isaac, we've seen, or when we read carefully the story even earlier, there's a sense which there's a lot of qualities about Isaac where he's kind of a passive male. And so Rebekah has profound influence on the situation. So they send Jacob to Laban. And one of the things I see in this is that Jacob, he's got the blessing, he's got the birthright, but when you think about it, his life is in danger and it's completely disordered, and he is trying to get away now. That's Rebekah's plan, get him out of here. So sometimes people can do all kinds of manipulating and deceiving to get their way. And then when you get your way, you go, the consequence of getting my way, it's dangerous. And that's part of what's going on.
Yeah, this is like I said, when I started about, being in solitude, this isn't an exciting thing for him. I think it's like over a 500-mile journey just to get to Laban. So if you can imagine being by yourself, traveling to that part,
yeah.
It's.
Yeah, so in chapter 28, beginning verse 10, that's where we are introduced. And I don't know Well, I think with the Abimelech story, there was a dream that was given to him that made clear what was going on, maybe not in the Isaac Abimelech, but with another one, with Abraham and Abimelech. But it's where we're introduced to dreams as a way that God reveals himself, right? And that's a very important biblical idea. And very often, God uses dreams to reveal himself, communicate with people who are not close to God. For example, he does that with Pharaoh in the Joseph story. He does it with Nebuchadnezzar in the Daniel story. He also will use dreams with, for example, Joseph. But you have this role that dreams play. It's also interesting in Matthew that when the angel comes to Joseph, and lets him know what's going on with Mary, what's really going on with Mary, because he's got this idea that she's gotten pregnant with a child because she's been unfaithful to him and their betrothal. But the angel comes to him in a dream. So dreams play a really big role, and even that whole view of dreams in the Old Testament and the New Testament is pretty different than the way we as contemporaries think about dreams. We primarily think about dreams not as a way of God getting a message to us, but primarily as our subconscious mind and just we learn things about ourselves. But what you find here is that people are learning things about God through a dream. So that's really interesting, and we'll come back to that in Joseph. But it says that, again, verse 10, Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. So he's on his trek. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in the place to sleep. So on your trek, did you use stones as pillows?
Close to it, yeah. Close to it.
Okay. And it says, and he dreamed, and behold, there was, now translation in NIV and ESV is a ladder. But if you notice the footnote in your, whether it be ESV or NIV, a flight of steps or stairway. And that, who did that song, Stairway to Heaven? Remember that song? I forget what the group was. Marty probably knows. Who did Stairway to Heaven? Eric Clapton, thank you. See, he's my resident guru there. But he sees this and reminds you a little bit of, do you remember another story that we looked at just briefly in Genesis that has this idea of a stairway into heaven? We've already come across it. Remember Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel? So you have what they're building apparently is what's called a ziggurat. And those ziggurats had a temple at the top, but you had these steps that go up, and the idea was you can ascend toward God, but also that the gods would come down to us. So he's seeing this stairway set up on the earth, and the top it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. The word angel there has, in the Bible, has to do with messengers. Angels are God's messengers. And so it looks like what's going on is in this dream, Jacob is seeing this activity of these angels that are, once again, back to election and God's sovereign will and all that, these messengers who are doing things in the world. They're not just up there playing harps or with little wings and all that kind of cute, chubby-looking little things. Instead, they're these, in the New Testament, when angels show up, people are fearful. And so he sees these angels moving about. And then it says, and behold, the Lord, and the ESV says, Lord stood above it. That word, I don't know Hebrew, but the way it's translated. So if you look in the note, at least in ESV, I don't know about the NIV, but it says, the other way to translate that word is beside him. So instead of above him, there's that sense of God now has come down and is beside Jacob. And said, I'm the Lord, the God of Abraham and your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of earth be blessed. Behold, I'm with you, and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I've promised you. So this is God renewing the covenant promise that he gave to Abraham and to Isaac. And then it says, then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord's in this place, and I did not know it. I think it's really important. So it's not that God was not in the place before the dream. It's that he recognizes that God is there with him. He just was completely unaware of it. He's so focused on his thing. He has no awareness of God. It's interesting. There's not much about Jacob so far in the story that shows that he has any kind of inclination towards God or religious experience or religious passion. He's kind of doing life the way the world does it. There are certain things you must do, and if it includes deceiving and manipulating, you do that because what you're after is you want to win this game called life. So he says, surely the Lord's in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid. So the question becomes, is he afraid because he realizes that he's sinful and that he's been the deceiver and all that? Or is he afraid because to be in the presence of God, very often the response is fear of the Lord. Like in Proverbs, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. There's that sense in which God is so much greater and so different from us that language cannot comprehend it. We are, if you and I were to be brought into God's presence, we would have that sense of awe and be bowing down to God in worship because he's an awesome God. And it says, he goes, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. If we had more time, we'd look at how Jesus in John chapter 1 uses this same idea when he's talking to Nathanael about how he is this stairway between heaven and earth, this connecting point between God and earth, and he's the one. So you see that sense in which he is the doorway, he's the gateway, he's the stairway in his incarnation. He's making something known about God that has not been known. And then it goes on, so it says, so early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head, and he set it up for a pillar and poured out oil on the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. And Bethel means house of God. And then Jacob made a vow saying, now listen to this. So God has revealed all these things, and part of what God has revealed is that this land's going to be yours, and there's going to be blessing to other people through you and all this. And so now here's Jacob's response to God. And I found this kind of interesting when I read it, and when some of the other people pointed this out. It seems that Jacob still is Jacob in his what he promises that he'll do. So here it is. If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be my God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a full tenth of it to you. So do you hear anything? I mean, when you listen to that vow that he's making, how does that strike you?
Well, I think there's pieces of this, which is, and like you're alluding to this, is that fear really the reverent fear that we'll see later? And I don't think it is. I think it's important to pay attention here that there's going to be another visit. There's going to be another time later.
When he comes back in. He's leaving now and he had this encounter. When he comes back in.
He's coming back to the same. And I think that this is, again, a couple things for me. One is this sort of idea of when you encounter God, it's usually not what you expect. And we'll see that throughout this story and others. I think there's also a reference to Mark 9 with the Transfiguration. And we see where Peter is he sees something, he's afraid, and he's jumping to conclusions about what he thinks God, and Jesus, or God says.
Let's get some tents.
Yeah, let's get some tents. And I think in some way this a little bit, so I think there is a piece that I'm reading that you are that's not necessarily, it's ungenuine, but it's not the true fear and the fear that leads to true, wisdom that we're talking about.
It doesn't show, it doesn't show Jacob's desire to be a blessing to all the nations and all that. Instead, it's kind of like, so if he really does this for me, then I promise I'll give a tenth of what I get. Mm-hmm. There's that kind of, but that's why it's a story of transformation. You see what Jacob is like here in these early stories, And then you see that he's going to be changed. And one of the things that changes him is where he's headed. He's headed to spend 20 years in the company of Laban, the great deceiver.
Well, one other thing,
Go
too,
ahead.
I think
Yeah,
that
yeah.
it's important, I think, for me to see that, and I read this in commentary about, he does say, surely the Lord is in this place.
This place.
And obviously he names it Bethel, the house of God. And I think that's, we just poked at him, but I think there's some sincerity that, and
Yes.
back to the ladder, God is not at the top of the ladder. He's right there. And I think that that's important because, he discovers that God is with him and God is here. And this idea of the house of God being here on earth is one of these first, places in Scripture we see that, God will always be with us in our presence.
Well, and it is his desire that we be aware of his with us. So Dallas Willard talks about the with God life. And that's not, Jesus makes a promise where 2 or 3 of you gather my name, I'll be with you. But it's an Old Testament idea. Here, so Jesus' name in that revelation by the angel is Emmanuel. You're supposed to name him Jesus, but he's also Emmanuel, which means God with us. When you find Moses delivering the people from Egypt. So in this Genesis, we're going to see how people get down into Egypt, and then we're going to see how they're brought out of Egypt. So just like Jacob is going to Haran, he's going to be coming out of that place. But there's that idea in the wilderness that God's with them. So they have a tabernacle that moves along with them. It's God's presence, the pillar of cloud by day, the fire by night. It's the God with us. It's David writing the 23rd Psalm. I will fear no evil because you are with me. Right. The question becomes for all of us, are we thinking of God as way up there at the top of the stairs? Or when you wake up in the morning, do you go, God's with me? And this life that I'm doing, I do it with God. I have to learn how to do it. It's not my goal to manipulate, to be the deceptive kind of person. It's my desire to learn how to do this life with God so that he really is glorified. Now then, because we don't really have time, but you look in chapter 29 through 31, part of what happens in this section of the story is in Haran, he meets Laban. He falls in love with a beautiful sister, Rachel. And you know the story. Laban says, if you work for me for 7 years, I'll give you Rachel. He works for 7 years for him. And Jacob deceives him. He gives remember how it's the older son, younger son, early in the story. Now it's the older daughter who's given to him in place of the younger daughter. And just like his father, Isaac, who didn't recognize that there was a switch going on, I don't know if he partied too hard or they just really quiet. I don't know what's going on, but he wakes up the next morning. That's when he realized, hey, wait a minute, I got Leah. And he's very upset with Laban for deceiving him. What have you done? And he goes, well, it's our custom that the older daughter's married first. But I tell you what I do. If you spend the week with her, this first marriage week, I got a deal for you. I'll give you Rachel, but you're going to have to work 7 more years. And one of the things that's interesting is that culture, usually it was the father of the bride who was paying. There was a thing that came. But that's been turned completely upside down because Jacob, when he left home, apparently didn't bring much with him.
Right.
And so he's having to work. So he works 14 years to get Rachel.
Well, they marry, I think this, obviously, he does go in and give Rachel.
He does go ahead and
right
give, yes, I thought I said it, but he does go ahead and give her. After that week, he gives Rachel. But now you got the sibling rivalry between Rachel and Leah. And you also see it's the battle of the babies, as I think Ian Provan talks about the battle of the babies. And so Rachel is barren, and Leah, God is blessing her. So it keeps emphasizing that Jacob loves Rachel, but Leah's the one who's having the sons. And then you also have the giving of the maidservants, the 2 maidservants to Jacob. So he started having all these sons and got all this going on. So after he's married and done the 14 years, he comes to Laban and he says, I've not made any money. I've been doing this. You've been deceiving me. And that's when Laban says, well, just work. And so Jacob offers this story. We don't have time because we're really out of it. But about the sheep and the spotted sheep and the striped sheep and all that. And Laban takes away all the sheep that matched that and moved them away with his other sons far away to try to put Jacob once again at a disadvantage. But God blesses Jacob and he increases. And finally the time comes where, and it's interesting, what makes the time when he knows it's time to go is when Joseph is born. So when Joseph is born by his beloved Rachel, that's when he sits down with Rachel and Leah and says, we've got to get out of there. Your father has cheated me. And the girls are not loyal to the father because they're going, yeah, he has cheated. And that's also where you see Rachel is there departing, and he's getting ready to have to go back to find Esau. As they're departing, that's where Rachel steals the household idol and hides it. And so once again, it's a family of deceivers. Everybody is really skillful at deceiving each other and trying to get their own way and manipulate things. But right in the middle of all of that is this idea of back to the election and God's sovereign purpose. God chooses us not because we're worthy. He doesn't choose us because we're really, really good. He chooses us. And that changes everything. And even with all of our mess-ups and things that we don't do perfect and right and good, it is God who is sovereign, who's working all things together for good. But when I don't align myself with him, Gregory, there are consequences. And 20 years of working for Laban, I don't know about you, but employment, a lot of times depends on who you're working for. It's not just the work you're doing, it's who you get to work for. I know ever since I've been at Madison, I've been grateful for my elders. It's a great group of elders who lead this place. They're not perfect, but they are really, really good men, and they love this church, and it makes it so much, it's fun. I look forward to every day because I get to work. But the people in that position are a different kind. It just means every day you're just kind of going, okay, until I get another job, I got to do this. I got to do this. I got to do this. But now he's leaving Laban, but he's going back to meet Esau. So that's where we'll pick up. So we'll next week, the story's Amazing Grace. So it's a week after that. We'll come back to this story, finish that up, position ourselves, maybe begin that night with looking at Joseph. Thank you for being with us. I don't think we ever got online. If we did, we did. Well, it's good to have you online for what part you were there. We're very, very thankful for Todd working that problem out. It's great to have you with us. And it's hard to believe that Sunday is August the 1st, a new month beginning. That's pretty impressive. Be praying for the Baja team as they return. And God bless you tonight. Thanks for being with us. Bye.